Okay, part 2 of Wednesday's task. We will finish our reading that's required and answer text-dependent question number 3 here. Okay, so we know that Shay, meaning Cassie, is talking to Big Mom right now. Cassie's learning a little bit more about her grandfather and about like how he was able to get the land. Okay, let's keep going. That's where he met you, ain't it, Big Ma? I asked, already knowing the answer. Actually, sorry, I already read that. We're here at the bottom. And he bought himself 200 acres from that Yankee, didn't he? Big Ma chuckled. That man went right on over to see Mr. Hollenbeck and said, Mr. Hollenbeck, I understand you got land to sell, and I'd be interested in buying me about 200 acres if your price is right. Old Mr. Hollenbeck questioned him good, but where he was going to get the money to pay for him. But Paul Edward just said, don't seem to me it's your worry about how I'm going to get the money, just as long as you get paid your price. Didn't nothing scare that man? She beamed proudly, and Mr. Hollenbeck went on and let him have it. Of course now he was just about as eager to sell this land as Paul Edward was to buy. He had it going for on nigh 20 years, bought it during the Reconstruction from the Grangers, because they didn't have no money to pay for their taxes. Not only didn't have tax money, didn't have no money at all. The war left them plumb broke. Their old Confederate money wasn't worth nothing, and both Northern and Southern soldiers had ransacked their place. Them Grangers didn't have nothing but the land they had to sell 2,000 acres of it to get money to pay them taxes and rebuild the rest of it. And that Yankee bought the whole 2,000. Then he turned round and tried to sell it back to him. Huh, Big Ma? Sure did, but not till 87, when your grandpa bought himself that 2 acres. As I hears it, that Yankee offered to sell all 2,000 acres back to Harlan Granger's daddy for less than the land was worth. But that old Fillmore Granger was just about as tight with a penny as anybody ever lived, and he wouldn't buy it back. So Mr. Hollenbeck just let other folks know he was selling, and it didn't take long for he sold all of it, 'cause it was some mighty fine land. Besides your grandpa, a bunch of other small farmers bought up 800 acres, and Mr. Jameson bought the rest. But that wasn't our Mr. Jameson, I supplied knowingly. That was his daddy. Charles Jameson was his name, Big Ma said. A fine old gentleman, too. He was a good neighbor, and he always treated us fair, just like his son. The Jamesons was what folks call Old South, from up in Vicksburg, and as I understands it, before the war they had as much money as anybody, and even after the war they managed better than some other folks, 'cause they had made themselves some northern money. Anyhows, old Mr. Jameson got it into his mind that he wanted to farm, and he moved his family from Vicksburg down in here. Mr. Wade Jameson wasn't but about 8 years old then. But he didn't like to farm, I said. Oh, he liked it all right, just wasn't never much hand at it, though. And after he went up north to law school and all, he just felt he ought to practice his law. Is that how come he sold Grandpa them 200 acres? Sure is, and it was mighty good of him to do it, too. My Paul Edward had been eyeing that 200 acres ever since 1910, when he done paid off the bank for them first 200, but old Mr. Jameson didn't want to sell. About that time, Harlan Granger come to the Granger plantation. You know, him and Wade Jameson about the same year's children, and he wanted to buy back every inch of the land that used to belong to the Grangers. That man crazy about anything that was before the war, and he wanted his land to be every bit like it was just then. Already had more than 4,000 acres, but he was just itching to have back them other 2,000 his granddaddy sold. Got back 800 of them too, from them other farmers that bought from Mr. Hollenbeck. Okay, that's actually our required reading for today. So I think it's good to just take a moment to process everything that's happening, because we hear more about the history of the land again. So just kind of recap, we learn that because of the war, we know that it's a civil war when the United States is fighting itself, those people who were living in the South were really affected, since that was the losing side. And so basically everyone in the losing side became really poor, because they created their own money system, and that money system means nothing since they lost. So because of that, we learned that the we learn how okay, so we learned that the Granger family was one of the families affected because they didn't have money, and so they end up selling some of their land. They basically sell all their land to get money. And then we have a Yankee. So if we don't know what a Yankee is, that means someone from the north, right? Someone from the north buys all the land. And it's mentioned that at one point, he actually, the Yankee, his name is Mr. Hollenbeck, he actually tries to sell their land back to the Grangers, but at that point, it says that Harlan Granger's daddy didn't want to buy it back. So it says Harlan Granger's daddy. So it says, as I hears it, that Yankee offered to sell all 2,000 acres back to Harlan Granger's daddy for less than the land was worth. But that old Fillmore Granger was just about as tight with a penny as anybody ever lived, and he wouldn't buy it back. So he actually tried to sell it back to the Granger family. And then we have Fillmore Granger, who it's saying is too cheap to buy it back. So Mr. Hollenbeck ends up just selling it to other people. 200 acres being to the Logan family. And then he also sells to this man named Mr. Jameson. So it says Mr. Jameson bought like the majority of it. So they know they have a connection with Mr. Jameson. And they said that it was through Mr. Jameson that he actually sold the Logan's 200 acres more. So as we know, at first, Cassie's grandpa buys 200 acres. He's able to pay that part off, and then he buys another 200 acres. So now we know where he gets his other 200 acres from, which is the Jameson family. Okay, so that's all really important details to learn about the land. And now we know that the Grangers afterwards, the next generation, he tried to buy the land back. So it says that man crazy about, and we're talking about Harlan now, so the one that is around with Cassie and her siblings. So now that when Harlan Granger came to be in charge, he said that he wanted to buy back every inch of the land that used to be the Grangers. So he's trying to gain back what they lost. And he's really crazy about trying to get everything back that they lost before the war. And he wants the land to be every bit like it was before. So they've already been able to get most of the land back. So he was able to get most of the land back. So he's able to get back 800 of them from other farmers that they bought from Mr. Hollenbeck. Okay, so they're on the quest to get their land back. Okay, but remembering the question that we're answering right now is actually number 3. So how does Mr. Morrison's and Stacy's relationship change in this chapter? So I'm going to go back to my evidence. So we know that their relationship changes because on this line here it says that they meet eye to eye and the two of them smiled in subtle understanding, the distance between them fading. So that's our proof that their relationship changed. Okay, and I think the one that really shows why it changes is maybe Mr. Morrison's explanation. I'm actually going to choose maybe this line right here where he says why, he's reminding Stacy why Mama asked them to stay away from the Wallace store. Because I feel like once Mr. Morrison's able to explain to Stacy like why he should explain things to his mom, Stacy respects him more. Okay, this is on page 22. So this means, now for this part, you should just explain like what Mr. Morrison's telling him here. So this means that Mr. Morrison thinks what? He's basically telling him that he thinks that their mama deserves to know, since you know, she's asking them to stay away from the Wallaces for a reason. And we're going back to the question. So why is this moment important for the relationship? So I would say this moment's important, or this shows that Mr. Morrison's and Stacy's relationship changes from here on out. Shows that Mr. Morrison's I'm gonna say like something like, because Stacy respects the fact that Mr. Morrison allows him to decide. So I feel like, to me, like Stacy is a person that really understands that Mr. Morrison respects him and sees him as an old enough person to make his decision. And I think that Stacy really gets a lot of respect out of that situation. Okay, so we are going to continue this tomorrow, and tomorrow we are going to find out what does Mama do in response to the children breaking the rules. We know that Cassie is really afraid, along with little man Christopher John, because they think that they're all going to get hit. So we will see tomorrow if they get hit.